Welcome to the Just Word Podcast. I'm Pat Bolland. The Just Word Podcast is brought to you by Justwealth, investing the way it should be, just for you. Alini is you might know her as the national online journalist for money and consumer affairs at Global News. And she had the TV show Money 123. She's now a personal finance journalist extraordinaire, and she joined us now. Erica, a real pleasure to meet you.
Hi, Pat. Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to meet you too.
You've just released a book, Money Like You Mean It, Personal Finance Tactics for the Real World. And as I went through, it's kind of like a well-rounded guide that dives into things like debt, housing, investing, those kinds of things. If you had to take a holistic view on personal finance, what's the biggest thing that you think has changed in the last, say, decade?
Yeah, so the book is really sort of a pretty comprehensive starter guide. If you're between your 20s and your 40s, that's who I wrote it for. And my general take on personal finance, which informs the whole book and is really, affects, yes, millennials like me and Gen Z, but really every generation, is that things are getting more complicated. There are a number of big forces, economic, technological, social, even climate change is sort of conspiring to make the day-to-day money management decisions, as well as the big financial decisions that we face in life, more complicated for everybody. And also we're increasingly on our own, trying to save for retirement, making investment decisions. So really the knowledge base that you need to make good decisions is getting wider and wider. And that was the prompt for me writing the book.
Okay. Well, when you look at millennials, are they inclined to be do-it-yourselfer kind of people? And if so, do they have the tools? Do they have the education to do that? And is in that part of what you're trying to accomplish?
So I would say more and more millennials are do-it-yourselfers. So it's funny because I started writing the book just before the pandemic. And so I had a certain idea in mind, and I had to sort of in real time change direction in a few places. And one of them was investing, because I was writing this investing chapter that was sort of addressing people who are afraid of investing. That's quite common, even still among millennials. There's this idea that's been there for a very long time in personal finance that, there's like basic personal finance, which is, budgeting, spend less than you make, that kind of stuff. And there's the advanced stuff, which is investing. And a lot of people treat it as optional. And I wanted to say, no, it's absolutely not optional. Unless you have a generous employer pension, you absolutely need to know about investing. But as I was writing, and we had, this pandemic bull market, so many young people started becoming DIY investors, especially millennials, younger millennials and older Gen Z. They just dived right into the stock market. And so at one point, I was like, I guess I have two groups to address: those who are afraid of investing and those who are feeling very, very confident about their own DIY investing skills because they started investing in this bull market and they haven't really lived through anything else. And then my main message is, no matter where you fall, like if you're afraid of it or you're super confident and you've had a really good run in the past, couple of years, you need to learn the basics. And that's what I sort of go over in my chapter on investing.
Wow. Yeah, interesting point that there's this split between investors out there. Do you get the sense that the investors that are comfortable are being too risky in doing things like investing in Bitcoin or high tech that they might not understand or those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think there's if you're talking about the millennial generation in particular, there's so I'm an older millennial or an exennial, almost, like at the crossroad between millennial and Gen Xers. And I think, if you look at millennials, there's a lot that what brings us together is the struggle to afford housing, but the big divide between older and younger millennials is the experience in the financial markets. I sort of quote unquote came of age financially speaking. I started being aware of financial markets with the financial crisis. That's where it really started, and so I saw that crash, and I saw how long it took for the market to recover. And this is really my second, the pandemic market crash of, the March 2020 was my second big dive. And then I knew that the recovery was so fast and so steep. But I had that frame of reference of, 2008, to help me, to guide me. And that, I personally experienced both. Whereas younger millennials, there's a lot of people who started investing just when the market started bouncing back from that very, very steep, but very short-lived dive that we had in the spring of 2020. And I don't really have any personal memory of how the market doesn't always bounce back the way it did in the pandemic. It's been a very weird market, and so yes, I think there's a lot of people who are overconfident out there, and frankly, your bragging rights or not, I would say, be careful, because it's what we've seen in the past couple of years is not typical.
Yeah. And that's not only true of what's happening in the stock market. And I was a little surprised that when you were talking about, the biggest changes we've seen for millennials, I would have said housing, because housing prices have, in the last 5 years have kind of doubled, and in some cases tripled. And that would affect you, right?
Yeah, and honestly, I think that there's a bit of a link between housing and financial markets, and then obviously, there's a link in that all kinds of assets have seen tremendous appreciation during the pandemic. From housing to stocks to Pokemon cards to crypto. There's a lot of people sitting at home with a lot of money, a lot of savings, and a lot of time, and I suspect that this has something to do with it. But I'm thinking, psychologically, I think for millennials here in Canada and possibly elsewhere too, because really, we have a global, crazy housing market. There's a psychological link, I think, between not being the feeling that you can't afford, that home prices are rising so much faster than you're able to save, than your income, and I think people sort of are chasing higher returns in the financial markets, possibly to kind of make up. I've certainly heard a lot of people who have invested their down payment in very risky assets to try and grow it fast, because the feeling is, if I just stick it in a savings account and rely on my own savings, I will never make it. And it's risky. I would never advise to invest your down payment put your down payment in stocks, let alone Bitcoin. But I do understand where people are coming from.
Against that background, then, should people consider renting as opposed to owning? Because the down payment is getting more and more substantial, and the debt obligation as well.
Yeah, yes. So obviously, housing is the challenge for my generation and the generation that's coming up after me. And I would say, so in the book, there's this stigma against renting, and I really push back against it very hard in the book. From a financial point of view, it really shouldn't make any difference, whether you're buying a house and owning or renting, both can work. From a financial point of view, like financially speaking, there's nothing wrong with renting. You can rent for your entire life. If you're able to comfortably save, and if you know how to invest, and you have, a diversified portfolio, and what you're doing, you're comfortable with taking a little bit of risk, in a broadly diversified portfolio, you can be a wealthy renter. However, a bit of background about me. I was born and grew up in Italy, and I had no concept when I moved to North America that there was anything wrong with renting. But after being a renter for many years between Canada and the US, I'm a little leery of renting in North America because, yes, from a financial point of view, there may be, both can work. But the truth of the matter is, there are a number of of lifestyle penalties that you often face as a renter. So first of all, you got to find a good landlord. Not always easy. There are good landlords out there. Not saying that there aren't, but you might face a lot of instability. Again, there are landlords out there who are happy to sign a multi-year lease, but especially if you're in a very hot, competitive rental markets, not so much. And most of all, if you are thinking of being a long-term renter and of having kids and you want something a little bigger than, a bachelor's apartment, it can be a real struggle to find that kind of rental apartment. Like most of the rental market is really geared to people who are, who don't have kids and don't really need very big homes, and that's a real issue, and it's not often addressed in personal finance. And so my frustration is that you get all this advice about how when you're doing the math, renting may make a lot of sense, but then go out there and trying to find the house that you need in a good school district, and be and trying to make sure that your kids are going to be in that school district until they're done with school. It's not easy.
And I've gone through a lot of those question marks in the past. But on the flip side of the coin, if you think about debt, and there's certainly a lot of debt you make the point in your book as well that there's a lot of debt in the country overall. But is debt really an issue these days with interest rates as low as they are? Mortgage rates are 2%. I remember when mortgage rates were 15%.
Yes, I would say it is an issue, although sometimes it's exaggerated, sort of how much of an issue it is. But yes, I think that is a big issue. And, mortgage debt is the big chunk of our debt, and mortgages are always treated as this very benign debt that you almost need to have to feel like you're a real adult here in Canada. But be careful, because people have taken on so much debt, and some of us are so stretched thin that interest rates can go up, right? And we'll be watching, what the Bank of Canada does, and certainly central banks across the world are expected to start to increase rates. And a lot of homeowners will be sheltered from this from maybe a few years, because most Canadians have fixed rate mortgages, and so you don't feel that right away. But I mean, another type of debt that comes, that's very common with homeowners, especially, the pandemic triggered a housing boom, but also a renovations boom. Lots of Canadians finance renovations with home equity lines of credit. They usually have variable rates, right? So if you have a big balance on a line of credit, then you're going to feel that right away.
It's interesting, Erica. The book tackles some areas that personal finance authors often don't. Things like couples and having babies. And one I found particularly interesting was insurance. And you dive into the world of insurance to a degree. How important do you see insurance these days against the background of things like climate change and fires and floods and those kinds of things?
Yeah, I feel like insurance is really one of the neglected areas of personal finance. And that's why I wanted to include it and make sure that it was in the book. And yeah, so I mentioned, when we were talking about the big trends that are making personal finance more complicated, that includes climate change. So take home insurance, right? It used to be this very straightforward thing. You'd buy your house, get home insurance. You can't even usually get a mortgage without home insurance. But that was it. Very, very plain vanilla, simple thing to do. And now you should ask yourself whether you're going to need flood insurance. many Canadians, if I remember correctly, it's about 20% of households in Canada are at risk of flooding. And I don't mean just flooding as in like, from rivers and lakes, although the number of Canadians who are at risk of overland flooding is growing and growing. But even if you're in a city, like in a big city like Toronto, and you have old city pipes, we're building and building and building, and these old pipes are carrying more and more water. We're getting these the rain showers that are like sudden downpours that overwhelm these old pipes. So the risk of having the water back up into your home and flood your basement has increased tremendously. Not to mention that so many of us now have finished basements because we can't afford bigger houses. So we're kind of expanding within the existing house that we have. And that really raises the cost of flooding. If you get finished, I think the average cost of a flooded basement in Toronto is $40,000, which is significant.
Is it?
And the thing is, you have to ask if you need flood insurance. Your plain vanilla home insurance will protect you against things like, I don't know, your dishwasher breaks, that kind of, your own pipe in the house sprung a leak. But they will not generally cover you for, the water backing in from the city pipes or overland flooding. And you need additional coverage for that. And you need to know to ask for it. And that's a classic example. That's a great example of what I mean by like, it's becoming more complicated and there's more that you need to know to make good decisions. Lots of people have no idea to ask for flood insurance when they get home insurance, nor do they know to check whether their home is in a floodplain or to sort of check the house when they're buying a new house to make sure that, and do all those little things that you can do to decrease the risk of flooding.
On a separate insurance side of things, what are your thoughts on life insurance? Because I've heard people in the past advocate life insurance as an investment vehicle. You for that or against that?
I think life insurance as an investment vehicle is pretty, it's pretty complicated. And it's also not something that I am, it's not a topic that I'm very familiar with. I'm a huge advocate of having life insurance. The typical case, the most people need life insurance because they have dependents and they want to make sure that their dependents are going to be okay if something happens to them. And the good news is if you're young and you're healthy, so-called term life insurance, and I explain what that is in the book, is so cheap. We're talking about very likely less than $50 a month. Probably maybe even 20. So something eminently affordable that you should absolutely have if you have a significant other or kids or any other people who depend financially on you.
Get the cheap term and then invest the balance is one of the messages.
Yeah, I would say you can just invest your savings, DIY. Keep it simple.
Absolutely. Erica, thanks so much. I enjoyed the book.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you did.
Erica Alini wrote Money Like You Mean It, Personal Finance Tactics for the Real World.